everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today I wanted to spend some time talking about something that I don't talk about very often, and that's creative nonfiction. Most of my editing related videos tend to kind of center on fiction, and as a reader I tend to gravitate toward fiction, but I do actually edit a great deal of creative nonfiction. Storylines in particular are really difficult to flesh out with creative nonfiction, like narrative fiction. Works of fiction can have super intricate plots that are really entertaining and believable, but narrative nonfiction can't really bend the truth to make the plot better. Nonfiction is always true by nature, so memoirists may write stories that seem like fiction. Maybe the chronological order feels linear like fiction. Maybe the suspense and action unfolds naturally, but as a memoir writer or a narrative nonfiction writer, trying to get your head around this idea of storyline and plot and how to engage the reader in general can be really tricky. I've worked on so many memoirs that just lack a central drama, a central driving question or goal, and readers lose interest. But just like in fiction, strong characters in narrative nonfiction can make up for a lack of exciting events or incidents. So today I kind of want to talk about chronological order and timelines, and then voice. So for this first topic of chronological order, I'm speaking largely to personal memoir, but you can apply this information to pretty much any narrative, fiction or nonfiction, that requires shifting around in a different timeline or covers a lot of ground. Travel books are the obvious category I think of, like Wild by Cheryl Strayed, where basically she's telling her experience while she's on the trail, but a lot of the book takes place in her past memories. She's moving around in time and thinking about her past memories, basically. Very often these kinds of books juxtapose information and memories about home and away from home. Historical novels, fiction and nonfiction, and biographies also kind of fall into this category. The author can really play with time to reach this dramatic effect, basically, by moving around to different memories. So the first thing I thought of here was The Nightingale by, is it Kristen Hanna, I think? The Nightingale goes back and forth between a present storyline and then largely takes place in 1940s occupied France. She uses these two storylines for a dramatic effect and without giving anything away. All I'm going to say is that at the end of the book, when the two timelines collide, there is a dramatic effect that happens and it pulls on your heartstrings. With timelines and event sequencing, I think there are two problems that authors face. Either the book is too structured and it's saturated with different timelines and dates that just aren't crucial to the main story, or the nonlinear storyline and plot is just kind of all over the place and jumps to different timelines and it's just really confusing for readers. So these are kind of the two issues, the over-detailed chronological plot line and then the non-linear plot that's sort of hard to follow and inconsistent. So there's this book on memoir. It's called The Art of Time and Memoir, and it's written by an author named Sven Birkitz, I think. And he has this to say about the topic of chronological order. He says, writers just starting to work with memoir often have a real difficulty with this crucial distinction between event sequence and story. The impulse to tell sequentially works with gravity-like force, generating structures that sag from the tedium of and then, recounting and producing dense thickets of ostensibly relevant information. The writer gets the dread feeling that everything belongs, that important moments only make sense when all the facts have been presented. Every first-time memoirist comes up against it, the demon of infinite regress. To get this, you have to know that. I just think that's really well said of the dilemma that creative nonfiction authors have. What should they include? How should they include it? Because it feels like when you have a story to tell that's already happened, you're not making it up as you go. There's a level of authenticity and truth that needs to happen. And so chronological order can be really challenging. Just know that if you want to tell a linear story, you may not be including all of the facts, all of the details, and that's okay. One way to weed through what's important, what you want to keep and what you don't want to keep, whether you're telling a linear story or a non-linear story, is to make a chart of sorts. Make an elaborate chart or table that details all of the events that happen, or basically a timeline. This may take a lot of time, but honestly, it's so worth it in terms of organization. Basically, all you need is a section name or chapter name, the page number, and like a brief description of what happens in that section. And it could be like a sentence or 2 sentences long. Oh, and you also want to include the year in which these events happen, just so you can make sure that everything's consistent. This can also help you kind of understand what sort of transitional phrases you want to use in between different events. Maybe structurally you realize that it makes sense to date the chapters, or maybe you realize that you want a certain number of chapters kind of clustered together within a section. If anything, this will help sharpen what needs to be sharpened so that you can go back and read with a different perspective, so that you can say, okay, which year did this happen in? Or maybe if you're 13 in this chapter, how are you 15 in the next chapter if it's been 4 years later? Things like that, inconsistency holes like that. These organizational tools really help you figure out what's working and what's not working. So maybe you use the age of your protagonist and different points of view to kind of shift the reader's understanding that time has passed. You have to become familiar with storylines and the way that memory and past events have been dramatized. How are you using scenes to heighten tension or show characters' emotions? How are you creating a sense of immediacy even in a flashback to make the reader feel as though it's happening in real time? As a nonfiction writer, event sequencing should be your priority over grammar every time. Well, once you get to the stage where you need to polish and look for grammar, you can obviously focus on grammar errors and things like that. But event sequencing at this point in the draft should be your main focus. Once you have your order down, you can go back and focus on imagery and detail and theme and other storytelling techniques. And also you can keep an eye out for past and present language. Conceptualize the story as it takes place in time, understand the narrative for what it is, and then you can go back and kind of keep an eye out for alternative storytelling techniques. Speaking of past and present language, I want to take some time to talk about voice, particularly with narrative nonfiction, especially with that shift in voice and perspective. Readers of narrative nonfiction are really looking for 2 things. They're looking to immerse themselves into the experience of the past, to really immerse themselves in the story, but also they want to hear the testimonial or the reflective voice, that reflective present voice that's searching for meaning. This isn't expository prose or summary, but rather the author's musings or reflections on the past events. For example, let's say you're writing a memoir and you get to a point in your story where a loved one passes away while you and your sister are still very young. You may have 3 separate voices here. The author as the child in that scene, the author as the information giver of the historical context, and then also the reflective voice. The reflective narrator is the author writing in hindsight. He or she is really talking about the events and the effects of those events years or months later. As an author of nonfiction, it's really important to understand that you're not simply recording undigested material or undigested memories. You're reflecting on the meaning of those events. So you're not necessarily tying everything up in a perfect little bow, but you are framing it through a lens of meaning. Still though, you want to avoid cliche-ridden phrases such as, looking back on it all now, I realize that time heals all wounds. That may be true, but it kind of waters down how the readers are experiencing those events for themselves. Don't be the philosopher, be the storyteller. You don't have to draw conclusions for the readers themselves. You just need to kind of hint at the meaning of those events and let them find it if it's there, kind of like a treasure map. But anyway, I also want to point out that another common thing that I see with memoir writers in particular are the 2 words, I remember. Oftentimes you don't need them, and I think it's something that we use to romanticize our own work. And sometimes it adds great value and there's this beautiful poetry to those words, I remember. But if you use them too often, it can really, really become grating for the reader because it isn't usually necessary. we know that you remember these events. That's why you're telling them. Removing those two words also invites readers into the immediacy of the scenes. So it kind of removes that distance a little bit. I remember those two words are great for dramatic effect every now and then, but you just want to make sure they're not habitually popping up in your work. Okay, I think that's all I'm really going to say for now about chronological order slash event sequencing and voice. But yeah, if you have any questions or thoughts about narrative nonfiction, I would love to hear them. Please leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. And also let me know what your favorite nonfiction book is. I feel like I don't talk enough about nonfiction in the booktube world, and I would love your recommendations. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye.